Alright, so now that we've collected all this data on the car in terms of the symptoms, we need to do some research. So you're going to need all data, you're going to need a nice computer screen with a mouse and a notebook. So let's write down what is affected, just symptoms. So the check engine light acting very weird, so we have either a control or a feed problem to the check engine light. Fuel pump relay clicks when the check engine light flashes, so we also have a control or a feed problem on the fuel pump relay. And then this P2725 kept popping up for the automatic transmission pressure control solenoid. So 3 problems with the engine control module, circuits. Okay? The car runs fine. It's very smooth, but on a cold start it does stall out a few times before it stays running. So keep that in mind. On this multi-info display, what problems do we have? So the screen light, the backlight, keeps going on and off at higher RPMs, together with the check engine light flashing and this fuel pump relay clicking. When the car was parked on a tilt, the low fuel indicator was also on, but it was kind of dim and also flashing together with the check engine light. And finally, the temp gauge, that was the original customer complaint, is wonky. I mean, it reads somewhere in the middle, but it's kind of up and down. So let's look at the wiring diagram for the information or multi-display and the instrument cluster and see how these 3 things can be possibly tied together. Okay, looking up the wiring diagram for instrument cluster. So we have our multi-display. It's a fancy unit with a whole bunch of light bulbs, and then page 2, multi-display, has a CPU. Okay, and then we have our actual combination meter with all the gauges. So we're worried about, there's our fuel indicator light. What makes that come on? So you have to read the little numbers here. So A15, if you want to know what A15 is, you go to this connector, A15, yellow and red. That comes from here, from the first page, from this junction connector, from ECU ignition to fuse 10 amp hot and on or start. And that also feeds the combination meter. You see A1, and A1, so sometimes it gets a little slightly confusing here. Where is A1? Right there. A1 feeds power supplies. That's the main power supply for this multi-display. And then it comes here and feeds some other stuff. Okay. So that's the power for the fuel indicator light, and when it's grounded on B10, then the light comes on. And we saw that it should be either on or off, but it was kind of buzzing with the relay, with the check engine light. So B10, this blue wire, that's the control wire for this bulb, goes to the first page, right back to our multi-display unit on B10. Now where's B10? B10, it's controlled by this CPU. Now how does the car know what the fuel level is? Well, there's our fuel pump sender in the tank, and then the signal wire goes to A8, and A8 also goes to the CPU. So the CPU sees the fuel level signal, and if it's too low, it turns on the bulb. Okay? So it seems like there's either a power feed problem to the bulb or the CPU voltage is not appropriate, and it's, you know, somewhere in the middle. It's turning that lamp on and off really quickly. That's why it looks dim, kind of flickers. Okay. So fuel low indicator, control by, we'll call it multi-display unit, MDU. Temperature gauge, it's a similar layout, so it's on the instrument cluster on the combination meter, and you know, by the diagram you can't really say, okay, temperature gauge, it's tied to this whatever logic board, and then you have a whole bunch of wires going to back to the multi-display unit. Where's our, there it is, water temperature sender on top of engine. So A15, and A15 again comes from this main CPU. So the CPU sees, you know, the temperature, and then controls the actual gauge through one of these wires, and you don't know which one it is, but they all come back to the multi-display unit. Okay, somewhere in this connector. So this MDU controls this temp gauge, also controlled by MDU, and the screen light. Again, I think it's this backlight circuit. You know, where's the main power feed come from? It looks like this right here. It's, you know, A3 and A10, and there's A1. So this thing is just supposed to come on when you turn the ignition key on, right? And then the dimming, when you turn your lights on, it's supposed to dim a little bit. So for example, A3 goes to, you know, that comes from a fuse, hot with tail relay energized. You turn your lights on, you get voltage on A3, that goes to your backlight circuit little box. A10 comes from interior light system, so that must be the dimmer switch. So you have input tail lights on, what your brightness wants to be, and this last wire, A11, and A11 is, there's white and black, it's tied to right here, junction connector, looks like a ground. So that's a ground. Okay? So that's our screen light. Now let's see how the ECM, how are these two tied together? Because the symptoms occur at exactly the same time. Okay, let's start with the check engine light. How does that bulb turn on? So we go to engine controls. There is our check engine light, malfunction indicator. So it's fed by gauge 1 fuse 10 amp, and then controlled directly by the engine computer on this black and yellow wire. So the engine computer has direct control of this bulb. It's just a bulb in the instrument cluster. We can see where it is. Malfunction indicator light, so D7, and it's fed by D4. Now D4 comes from, yep, gauge 1 fuse, so that makes sense. And what else does D4 feed? Well, it also feeds this traction off indicator light, the VSC light, and if you remember, these two lights stayed on full brightness, no issues at all. But the check engine light was flickering. So that tells me right there, just by looking at the lights, that the problem is on the control side of the check engine light. Okay? It's not a feed problem. It is a ground side switch problem at the engine computer. So we can cross out feed just from logic and wiring diagrams. I didn't do any actual measurements yet. So we're focused on the CEL control. Okay. Fuel pump relay. Let's take a look at that on the engine controls diagram. And that would be right here. The circuit opening relay feeds the fuel pump. So this relay going click, 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 click. And we took it out and the car, stalled out eventually because the fuel pump was off. So again, control side problem. There's feed and then there's the actual ground side control. So let's see where the feed comes from. It comes from this junction connector. All of this is tied together. Also the ignition 2 relay. I guess some other stuff, but this black and orange wire comes from pin 1 right from the ignition switch, on or start. Okay, so black and orange wire, we have voltage on there. That feeds the fuel pump relay and also ignition 2 relay. Okay, so what is ignition 2 relay responsible for? So there's 2 wires coming off of that on 2 and 7. So there's 2. Okay, so it feeds all of the ignition coils. And then 7 comes over here to 11. 11 over here. All of the fuel injectors. Now, the car runs, when it runs perfectly smoothly. It doesn't hiccup. It doesn't, stall out on the road while the relay's clicking. The fuel pump relay's clicking. So, what does that tell you? Again, by logic, the feed to the fuel pump relay must be good, because the feed to all the other relays must be good. They're not clicking. Fuel injectors and the ignition coils aren't shutting off. Car drives really nicely, no hiccups. So again, I'm going to cross out feed and focus on the control for the fuel pump relay. So let's go back to the fuel pump relay, and that's right here, circuit opening relay. So we have to follow the control wire now. That goes to 14. There's 14. Straight across to FC at the engine computer. So control by ECM, control by ECM, and finally 2725, this automatic transmission pressure control solenoid. I looked up the actual code, and it's a current duty cycle controlled solenoid. Okay, SLN and SLN, plus and minus. And on our wiring diagram, the solenoid, SLN minus and plus, these 2 wires go 8 and 9, 8 and 9, 12 and 13, 12 and 13, right to the engine computer. So the engine computer is directly responsible for both SLN plus and minus. Now, one of them might just be a ground, the other one is, positive side switched, but in either case, it's both wires go to the ECM. So again, controlled by ECM. So we're having problems with the check engine light, fuel pump relay, and this automatic transmission pressure control solenoid. Otherwise, the car runs great. So what is the common thread here? All these things occur at the same time. Flashing check engine light, fuel pump relay clicking. This code sets some of the time. The screen on the MDU, the multi-display unit, goes on and off. And the temp gauge, so we're not exactly sure what's going on with the temp gauge, but it's erratic. Okay? So, for now, we can focus on the temp gauge a little later. What's the common thread? Common power or common ground? So let's look at both diagrams, and the easiest way to do this is actually to look at power and ground distribution. So on ground distribution, what I found was there is a shared ground between the multi-display unit and the engine control module. And it's right here, EB at left front of engine on surge tank. That's the intake manifold. There's another ground right next to it, also on the surge tank. So I want to focus on this EB. Where is EB? EB looks like it's on kind of on the right, closer to the passenger side, and EC is the one that's really hard to get to. It's on the back side of that aluminum surge tank. Alright, now I don't want to touch this yet. Where can we easily test the ground where it's non-intrusive? So can we test at the multi-display unit? That involves taking the dash apart. Engine control module, again, it's under the dash somewhere. Idle air control valve. Okay, so this must have a manual throttle body maybe. But let's find this brown wire, back probe that, maybe get a scope, and see if we see anything weird, like an elevated voltage on that ground wire. That's the next step. Now we're actually going to take a voltage measurement after all that, test driving, taking notes, looking at wiring diagrams, and I want to go to the car and find the problem, first try. Because in this case, if it's a poor ground and you touch something and you fix it, that's going to be it. We probably won't be able to reproduce this. So I want to measure somewhere away from the main ground point to prove this is the problem, and then hopefully we'll be on the right track. Maybe we're completely off base here. Okay, so under the hood, the ground EB is this nut right here holding those wires. It looks fine, but let's take a measurement with the scope, just one channel, so reference to battery ground, on this brown wire at the idle air control valve. That's the ground that goes to that EB, tied into that. So let's start it up. Got the PICO scope set up, just one channel, and just 0 to 5 volts. So let's turn the key on, see what happens here. Start up. There it is. There it is. We got a bad ground, guys. Absolutely. That was the coolest scope capture ever. Look, we went up to 2 volts. Let me save that. We can rev it up, see if the voltage goes up or down, and we just need to fix that ground. Alright, let's try that again. Key on, fire it up, clicky, clicky, clicky. Oops. It's really not happy. We're at 2 volts. We'll rev it up. There's the that's amazing. Clicky, 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 clicky. So the computer doesn't like that either, huh? That is just the coolest ground scope capture ever. Amazing. Alright, so before we go messing with that ground, I want to see, is the search tank itself well grounded? So second channel, same scale. see here. There's 0 to 5 volts. And let's fire it up. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So what did that just prove? The engine ground is fine. Look, that stays at 0. This goes up to 2 or 3 volts and then starts buzzing and clicking and carrying on. So let's undo that nut, retighten it, and this should go right to 0. Alright, so we're going in for the victory shot. Is this ground loose? Let's wiggle the wires. Yep. Absolutely. There it is. Someone didn't tighten it down. So once we tighten this nut, and it seems like it was staged, wasn't it? The guy's been dealing with this for six months. So all you do is tighten this one nut down, and this car will be as good as new. And we'll see if the temperature gauge is also good. Let me check the one in the back. Okay, that's that one's fine. That one's tight. You can't even see it from here. Let's run the same exact experiment and make sure there are no trouble codes, no clickies, everything's good. Alright, I'm excited. Moment of truth. Just one channel. That's the ground at the idle air control valve. On, and that's it. No clickies. Solid check engine light. Let's scan that, clear that out, take this car for a spin, see what the temperature gauge does. I hope that will be fixed as well. Simply amazing. So that was actually one of my favorite case studies, at least of this year. The logic and the data went right to the exact problem, just by looking at the symptoms and looking at wiring diagrams. It just, you know, that's one of my favorite feelings, is nailing it just from the symptoms and the wiring diagrams. We did one measurement with the scope, and boom, that's the problem, and fixed it with a 12mm wrench. The fix took 5 seconds, but how much would you charge the customer for this? How many shops has he taken it to? Specialty electrical shops. He even wrote me a whole history for this car. We'll look at that in bonus footage. You guys will see how out of hand this could have gotten. Even he took it to the dealer, and a Toyota master technician, 30 years experience, you won't believe what he recommended. Alright, so for now, let's clear out this 2725 trouble code. And we'll see if the check engine light, yep, it turned off. So we'll shut the car off. Key on. Beautiful. Read fault code. And let's take it for a spin. Let's see what the engine temperature does. So I'm noticing a little hissing sound coming from the engine bay here. What the heck? Don't shoot that off. That's not right. Let me pop this off. I'll fix that vacuum hose. See where that hissing's coming from, and then we'll take this car for a test drive.